today is going to be in three parts, and the first part's going to be rather self-indulgent. I mean, I'm here to talk about my book, so I thought I'd tell you how I came to write it. And it probably is important to say at the outset that I didn't come to Hayek as I think most people in this room would have come to him, as either a conservative or a libertarian, but as somebody who was interested in the history of economic thought. That was the area that I did my PhD studies in economics. And I just found that actually the area within economic thought that I was first interested in was economic methodology. And it didn't have really anything to do with Hayek and the Austrians. And you might not know what economic methodology is, but I'll tell you some of that during my talk too. Okay? So how I came from this very different place to becoming a student of Hayek's, and as Steve said, I mean, I'm now the general editor of Hayek's collected works. I'll be working on Hayek until my dotage. I mean, if that hasn't arrived yet. So it's someone whom I've been fascinated with for over 20 years. So that transition. And one of the things I'd like to emphasize is, you know, in telling this story about how I got there, I mean, many of you are young, you may be going into academia, so it's nice sometimes to hear stories. If you take a look at Roger Garrison's book, Time and Money, the beginning of that, he tells a similar story. And I think these sorts of stories kind of show at least ways that you can get into it. And also, by the way, realizing I was coming to speak at the fourth session or the fifth session of the day, this is a time when you could use storytelling rather than having a lot of heavy duty stuff. So I'll be telling some stories today. I'll talk about how that initial interest became a fascination, and then at the very end I'll talk a little bit about the structure of the book, because the structure of the book is different. It really shows you a different side of Hayek, and it's because I came at him with that prior interest in methodology. So I'll try to give you some sense of what, in case you ever should take the book out of the library, you know, what you would be expecting if you went there. Okay, so back to my early days in graduate school. The first few weeks of graduate school, I really loved economics as an undergraduate. Went to grad school, and they don't do this anymore in graduate schools in economics, but as first month or so in micro theory, we had a section called economic methodology. And economic methodology was supposed to tell you what it means to be scientific. You know, how do you do economics scientifically? Economics, after all, is very much of a science, so economic methodology tells us exactly what that means. Now, I thought, fair enough, this sounds pretty interesting. There were two big-name economists, Paul Samuelson and Milton Friedman, and each of them had written a significant piece about economic methodology. Now, it turns out that these big-name economists disagreed with each other. And in addition to disagreeing with each other, when I read what they said, I thought both of them were saying ridiculous, absurd things. Okay? So these are two big-name economists. I've decided I'm going to be an economist. I've entered grad school, and we start right off with these two big-name economist readings. So, I mean, what sorts of things were they saying? Friedman's position was, the realism of a theory's assumptions don't matter. All that matters is predictive adequacy, how well the theory predicts. If you get two theories that predict equally well, choose the simpler one. That's all you need to know about economics. This is how you do economics scientifically. This is what Friedman said. Paul Samuelson, and by the way, you won't remember this because of your age, but it used to be in Newsweek that alternate between Milton Friedman and Paul Samuelson giving analyses of recent news stories, and they'd always give, one would be basically a social democratic view, the other would be the Chicago view, going back and forth. So these were big-name economists, not just to me, but to anybody at the time. Paul Samuelson says, scientists never explain, and he put scare quotes around the word explain, like this was a kind of a suspect word in the first place. Scientists never explain any behavior by theory or any other hook. It's a direct quote. All they do is describe behavior. Now, this made no sense to me. And of course, as is true with most of my graduate education, instead of trying to make sense of it, they just moved on to the next subject. We never had anything more about it. We read this stuff, and they just left us there. And I thought, well, what's going on here? Two big-name economists saying things didn't make sense. What should I do? Well, it turns out I became hooked on this. It became an interesting topic to me. And I ended up having a dissertation advisor who had written a dissertation on the economist named Vilfredo Pareto, an Italian economist, and he talked about how Pareto was one of the first to introduce positivist philosophy of science into economics. So he said, well, you're interested in these questions. You know, for my dissertation, what I did, says Vince to me, was review philosophy of science and then look at the stuff that Pareto had to say. Why don't you, philosophy of science has changed in the last 30 years. Why don't you review it and take a look at some of these methodological debates that you heard about in your early micro course? It's a great idea. So the importance of having a good dissertation advisor. Okay, this is something to, just don't take whoever comes along the pike. Try to get the good ones who have good ideas. So this is exactly what I did. My dissertation was called Beyond Positivism. I call it that because what I did was to review 20th century philosophy of science, which you can categorize as starting with the Vienna Circle and logical positivism. If these words don't mean anything to you, don't worry. Then logical empiricism, then Karl Popper and falsificationism, and then people like Thomas Kuhn and Imre Lakatos and P.K. Feyerabend. Okay, names may not mean anything, but this is the development of 20th century philosophy of science. And then use this to see how that knowledge of that literature would help me assess the arguments that were being made, because that's what the professors failed to provide. It was a means of assessing the arguments that people were making, and philosophy of science seemed to be a ready-made literature to be able to do that. And so I analyzed a bunch of debates. Now, what I found was pretty bizarre. First of all, economists had borrowed sometimes from this philosophical literature, the philosophy of science. But their borrowing had been really haphazard when they used it at all. And often in their haphazard borrowing, they got it wrong. Okay, they weren't philosophers, they were economists. They read a little philosophy, they say, we'll apply it this way. And they had misapplied it. Now, secondly, the philosophy of science that they had borrowed from was principally written with the physical sciences, not the social sciences, in mind. It was some variant of positivism, that word that springs up again. And finally, the economists had pretty much missed the fact that positivism had by and large been discredited within the philosophy of science. By 1970 and onwards, the swan song for positivism was one of the afterwards in a famous philosophy of science textbook. It was viewed as a discredited view. So in a nutshell, my finding was that economists, in talking about what it meant to be a science, were borrowing badly from a defunct philosophical position. Now that's a pretty strong and bizarre conclusion. On the one hand, this was wonderful because it gave me plenty of things to write about. But on the other hand, it brought me no closer to understanding why economics looked the way it did. And I may as well put all my cards on the table. I loved economics as an undergraduate. I thought it was one of the most powerful tools in the world for understanding social behavior. When I got to grad school, it was like we were doing a totally different thing. And I wanted to find out why grad school economics was so much different from what I had gotten as an undergraduate. I thought wrongly that understanding this methodological literature, that there was some sort of profound philosophical basis to this. In fact, there wasn't. I mean, anything that economists had to say about why they were doing things the way they were had no tie to anything. It was not connected to that literature, not justified. At that point, so I was happy to have lots of things to write about, but unhappy in terms of my actual intellectual quest to figure out what was going on in economics. At that point, I started to turn towards alternative literatures. There's lots of alternative groups within economics. Institutionalists, post-Keynesians, Austrians, Marxists. All of them took issue with the way mainstream economics was taught, how it was studied, how it approached problems, and they were much more conscious about their methodological presuppositions. So I thought maybe if I understood those groups better and then compare and contrast with the mainstream, this might shed some light. This is how I started to get involved with the Austrians. And I really wish I had brought the T-shirt that I had dug out of a drawer, because I've got the University of Boulder, Colorado, 1979 Austrian seminar, something just like this that I attended that really tripped my trigger. It was a 2-week program in Boulder, Colorado. I mean, this is nice here, but Boulder's nicer. Okay, Boulder's really nice. And who were the teachers? Israel Kirzner, Jerry O'Driscoll, and Roger Garrison, the guy you just heard. And he didn't tell his joke that I can remember about when he was driving through the Alabama backcountry, and he ran into his first Keynesian auto mechanic. And the story he told was, his car kind of breaks down, and he finally gets a mechanic to come down the road, and they open up the hood, and Roger says, can you get it to run again? And the Keynesian auto mechanic said, well, the real question is, how did it ever run in the first place? I always loved that one. But anyway, that was the kind of experience it was. This got me going in a direction of studying the Austrians. It wasn't actually Hayek that got me involved at first with the Austrians. It was Ludwig von Mises, because he, of course, those first 7 chapters of Human Action are all about methodology. It was a methodology that, if you come to it from having studied positivist philosophy of science, is diametrically opposed. Remember, von Mises is saying that you deduce the theorems of economics from a set of axioms of human action. These axioms are known a priori to be true. They're apodictically certain. And if the verbal chain of logic from axioms to conclusions is correct, the conclusions follow with apodictic certainty as well. Axioms can't be tested, but they do make meaningful statements about reality. Now, all of these claims, which is part and parcel of those first 7 chapters, are at variance with various ideas that you get in 20th century mainstream philosophy of science, or positivist philosophy of science, before the 1970s, when positivism had been discredited. The analytic synthetic distinction in terms of what sentences are. If they're analytic, they're either tautologies or false. There's two categories there. Synthetic make claims about the world, but you can't have, as Mises was saying, a priori statements that at the same time make statements about states of the world. Okay, this was just ruled out as a category. This would be ruled out as a category error. So clearly, these are 2 very, very different positions. Karl Popper falsificationism. I know there's a person in this audience who disagrees with this, but Karl Popper's views on how the essential part of science is trying to test and refute theories seem to be quite different from Mises's claim that if you look at the axioms of human action, they're untestable, and it makes no sense to test them. So it seemed to be that there were interesting contradictions there, and I wanted to learn more about it. I went to NYU, was at the Austrian program at NYU for a year. Larry White was an assistant professor there at the time. Rizzo, Kirzner, O'Driscoll were all on faculty. Fascinating time. Ludwig Lachmann, another name you may know, would come there every spring term. So it's just rich experience after rich experience. And it was at that point that I started to get seriously interested in the Hayek. Now, I'd like to shift gears. I got to the second point now. Why did this initial interest become a fascination? Well, I'm an historian of thought, and at the very beginning, there were certain practical matters why Hayek looked like he might be an interesting research topic. He lived a long time. Okay, born in 1899, dies in 1992, and by the way, some of these things, are there any people here who are interested in history of ideas? As a potential, oh, lovely. Well, okay, just go along. Think about these things, okay? These are very pragmatic concerns. Lives a long time, has a huge archives at the Hoover Institution, over 130 boxes at this point. Controversial. Lots of people interested in him. Because he's controversial, a lot of people write crap about him. They write really bad things. They misinterpret him. People that are both pro-Hayek or anti-Hayek. And as an academic, when you find bad things, you write responses to it. This is something you can do. And I hate to say this, but he was almost dead. Okay? And once somebody dies, their work is finished, and then you can start. You can actually start doing the work on it. All very pragmatic. Is there another economist who needs a biographer, who's recently dead, who's famous? Milton Friedman, okay? We need his biographer. Let me tell you, one of the missions, you've all seen the Blues Brothers, I'm on a mission from God too, okay? My mission from God is trying to promote the history of economic thought. We don't want it in the hands of people like Naomi Klein This is the way a lot of people are learning about Milton Friedman, frankly. Okay, and she gets written up in the New Yorker. Bruce Caldwell doesn't get written up in the New Yorker for his work on Hayek. Naomi Klein is going to get written up. This is how people are learning. And Naomi Klein, if you don't know the name, is the author of the Shock Doctrine, which basically says that he was behind Pinochet and all sorts of things, all sorts of terrible things that happen in the world. We're all part and parcel of the grand plan of the Chicago School economists. Okay, their plan to take over the world. So I mean, it's not quite as bad as that, but in other ways, it's even worse. So this is not the way that people should learn. So this was one reason why I was. These are some of the reasons I was initially interested, but in addition, I was interested in how economics got off whatever path it may have been on, why it turned out the way it did in the 20th century, and Hayek was custom made for that. Because, and again, if you look at your handout, I finally get to the handout part, it's on two sides, right? One side has Hayek's contribution, so yeah, this is something to take home with you if you ever thinking, geez, I wonder what Hayek I should read next. Yeah, you can pick your period, you figure out what you want to read there. But on the other side is the chronology. If you're interested in the 20th century in economics, Hayek's a great guy to study because he managed to always be in the right place at the right time. He starts out in fin de siècle of Vienna, right? A period of enormous intellectual excitement in a whole variety of fields. But the Austrian School of Economics, of course, the one that we're interested in, was founded there. He studies under von Wieser. He goes to America right afterwards with letters of introduction from Joseph Schumpeter. In America, he meets the father of American institutionalism. Veblen is often viewed as the father, but Wesley Clair Mitchell is certainly one of them. Takes a class with Wesley Clair Mitchell. It's a class on the history of economic thought, in which Mitchell was saying, here's how economics went wrong, and here's why institutionalism is right. This is a course that Hayek sat in on when he was 24 years old, sitting there going, oh, I don't know about that, I don't know about the institutionalism is right part, So he comes back, he sits in on Mises's private seminar. Lionel Robbins, a young professor, 30-year-old guy at the LSE, invites him to give 4 lectures on the basis of which he's offered a position at the London School of Economics. He goes there. As soon as he gets there, he gets in a fight with John Maynard Keynes, which you'll hear more about analytically with Roger next time. But the actual story is wonderful. This is before Keynes's general theory, before 1936. This is in 1930. He publishes a book called A Treatise on Money, and this book is 2 volumes and borrows from a Swedish economist who wrote in German named Knut Wicksell. At the same time, Hayek is publishing a book, Monetary Theory in the Trade Cycle, and then later Prices in Production. Also draws on the work of Knut Wicksell. The difference between Keynes and Hayek is that Keynes didn't read German. Well, he read German, but as he put in a footnote, I only read enough, in German I can only understand things I already know, is basically what he said in one of the footnotes to his book. And a wonderful piece of self-deprecating humor, but actually fatal in this instance, because Hayek writes a review of the book and says, well, he draws on Wicksell, but he seems to leave out the capital theory that was so important to Wicksell, and as a result, the Treatise on Money is full of real problems. This is supposed to be a 2-part review. So this young Austrian guy shows up and writes the first half of a review that basically says that Keynes should have read more German if he's going to use this guy's framework. Before the second part of the review of Hayek's review of Keynes comes out, Keynes comes back with a defense in which he starts attacking Hayek's book, which was unprecedented. Instead of defending his own, he says, well, yeah, but this guy's book is really bad. So this was the battle that took place. I'm getting so excited I need some water. Excuse me. Okay, so he engages with Keynes, but he's not the only one. He's probably the most famous, but throughout the 30s, Hayek is debating with people on capital theory, Frank Knight, an American economist. There's the socialist calculation debate that, I don't know exactly how many of these things you've dealt with already in detail, but that took place in the 1930s with Oscar Lange and a host of other economists. So all of these famous economists he's engaging with. As the war begins, he writes The Road to Serfdom. Immediately after the war, he founds the Mont Pelerin Society. And this brings together, again, a whole group of economists. He then finally moves to the University of Chicago in 1950. He's there when the Chicago School of Economics starts to be formed. So throughout his career, he's interacting with people. He helped bring Karl Popper, by the way, to the LSE as well. Okay, so this side of it basically tells you some of the things that he did. So right place, right time. But unfortunately, at least from most people's perspective, Hayek always had the wrong ideas. Okay, this was in comparison to the rest of the profession. Okay, so let's see what I mean by that. Let's see if I've forgotten anything too. Okay, right. So way back in the 1920s, he's already arguing for a very limited role for econometrics in economics. Empirical studies would be the way he put it then. He said we can't really learn very much from empirical studies. Recent economic history is the way Mises would put it, and Hayek pretty much agreed with that. So he pretty much, and by the way, this was not an unusual standpoint at the time. John Maynard Keynes, for example, shared this particular view. So he missed the econometrics revolution. He opposed the use of aggregate price level and other aggregates in economics. He felt that theories that use them, like, and this is in his early work, the quantity theory, missed the effect of changing relative prices, which in his model were important. Obviously in terms of the capital structure. You just heard Roger Garrison's lecture on the macro of capital structure. So his initial target was actually quantity theory of money. This is pre-Friedman, but the quantity theory as it existed then. And then in the 30s, Keynes comes up with this labor-based approach to macro, but also one that uses these aggregates, something that he rejected. So he was out of step with those two major contenders in the mainstream, Keynesian macro and later monetarism. At a time when the disciplines were becoming more and more specialized, he was undertaking more integrative studies. One of his famous quotes that I love is that if you want to understand social phenomena, you have to understand economics, but it's not enough. If you only understand economics, it can be just as dangerous as knowing nothing. You need more. In the 1950s, there was also a formalist revolution in microeconomics. Now, this is kind of ancient history at this point because it's less important. But this was the new wave back in the 1950s. General equilibrium theory associated with Samuelson, Kenneth Arrow, Gerard Debreu, and others was the way to do economics scientifically. Again, now this was based on an earlier tradition that had started with Walras and Pareto, and in fact, Hayek and Robbins were among those that introduced this continental tradition to British economists and to English-speaking economists in the 1930s. They liked the stress on the interdependence of economic phenomena. That was a basic insight that comes out of general equilibrium theory. But during the socialist calculation debate, in the course of that, Hayek came to see the limitations of this particular theory for understanding the differences between a socialist economy and a free market economy. In particular, what was bothersome to him was the assumption of perfect information. The theory, general equilibrium theory, assumes that all agents have access to the same and correct information. Now, for Hayek, of course, this was at variance with what is true in the world. In the world, what you've got are lots of different agents. These agents have different bits of information. Some of the information that they have is wrong, so some of it's incorrect information. And in a phrase, there's a dispersion of knowledge, and in such a world, the question then becomes, in a world of dispersed knowledge, how is it that social coordination ever is even possible? How could it ever possibly occur? Now, static equilibrium theory, a theory by assuming perfect information, assumes away the very problem. I mean, if everybody's got the same correct information, there is no dispersion of knowledge, there is no problem of coordination. It assumes it all away. And he points out this is why the socialists could say, well, look, we can represent a socialist economy with general equilibrium theory or a free market economy with general equilibrium theory. It's just a matter of who's making the decisions. In a free market, entrepreneurs make decisions. In a socialist economy, the planners make the decisions. But basically, you can represent both of them formally with the same apparatus. There's no difference between them. That was taken as a serious argument in the 1930s. And he was pointing out, well, in fact, if you've got everyone with perfect information, there is no problem. But if you've got a world of dispersed information, then you do have problems. And that kind of model won't work. So this was the question that Hayek asked in Economics and Knowledge. And where he answered it in a number of ways over his career, but I'd say the use of knowledge in society, something that probably all of you have read, is his best response to this, pointing out the role of freely adjusting market prices in providing information about relative scarcities, the image of the economy as this wonderful machine, a marvelous machine, as he put it, that on the one hand, everybody's decision is based on prices, but everyone's decision feeds in and creates the prices. So you're reacting to the prices that are out there, but your reaction and a million other people or hundreds of millions of other people in a given market are also what creates it. And that ebb and flow, and why you could never really create that with a socialistly planned state. Now, all of these things seem to be things that he's missing. He also, after The Road to Serfdom, was challenged by Keynes and others to say, what is your positive vision? You're very good at criticism, but what is your positive vision? Some of his later work in political theory, Constitution of Liberty and Law, Legislation of Liberty, trying to outline the sorts of institutional structure that would promote liberty and actually make the best use of knowledge, of individual knowledge that, if you read the Constitution of Liberty, the liberty part is in there, but there's also that constant refrain, how are we going to set up a system where we can actually make the best use of people's knowledge? So that knowledge question is in there as well. Market system, democratic polity, under a strong constitution, protecting a private sphere of individual activity, under the rule of law, with well-defined and enforced property rights. If you wanted a single sentence to capture 3 volumes, 4 volumes of work in that particular dimension, that's the sort of thing that he was aiming for. Finally, this was the heyday of positivism in economics, and he started to write articles against scientism. He has an essay called Scientism and the Study of Society. If you're interested in these methodological and philosophical issues, it's a very good place to start. And scientism was his claim that we were taking the wrong approach in economics. That, in fact, we're applying methods of what people thought were the methods of the physical sciences to the social sciences. And he thought in particular it was wrong to apply such methods to what he called complex phenomena. Hayek argued that many phenomena exhibit characteristics of complex, adaptive, spontaneous orders. Now this, you probably have not read his psychological work here, but this extends everywhere from the formation of neural connections in the mind, various aspects of perception, to certain animal behaviors, then finally to a variety of social institutions, language, use of media of exchange, other aspects of market behavior, perhaps even an aesthetic sense, and moral codes. He says these are examples of spontaneous orders. This doesn't mean like spontaneous combustion, where somebody just explodes on it, but it means that people are forming orders without any intention to form the order. They're behaving in certain ways, and not through their design, orders are formed. The idea of a market, Paris getting fed is a perfect example. No one plans to feed Paris, but the actions of millions of people do it every day. Every day. So, he drew some methodological conclusions from this, and so here I'm bringing you back to the beginning of my talk. If you've stayed with me all this time, you'll actually get that little payoff. What he drew from this were some methodological conclusions about social phenomena. The first is we face severe limitations in our ability to predict when we confront complex phenomena. Often the best we can do is form pattern predictions, make pattern predictions, or provide explanations of the principle by which a pattern emerges. Excuse me. Now, by the way, I started with Friedman and Samuelson, and if you remember what I said about them, this directly opposes both of them. Okay? So, what's he saying? Best we can do is make pattern predictions. We can't make precise predictions. For Friedman, making precise predictions was the sign of what science was all about. Hayek thought of Friedman methodologically as a naive positivist. He actually used that phrase in some of his interviews. In another interview, he said, you know, people, I've often apologized to people for not reviewing Keynes's general theory, but the piece I really should have reviewed was Friedman's methodology of positive economics, which is a far more dangerous piece. He said that in comparing Friedman's methodological piece with Keynes's general theory. That's a significant statement. Or maybe he said it's an equally dangerous. I don't want to overstate it. Maybe he said it was an equally dangerous piece. But still. You can't make these precise... Trying to hold economics to the standard of making precise predictions is a false standard. You'll have a misallocation of resources. You'll keep trying to make better predictions and failing, just like the government does. Whenever it fails, you just put more money into it. You just put more resources into it. Keep trying. To the extent that progress can be made at all in science that study complex phenomena, it'll occur by developing better explanations, but these explanations typically are those where the theories are less falsifiable. So in this regard, of better explanations, he's going in the opposite direction from what Samuelson was saying. So Hayek was actually offering a vision of what was possible in economics that was quite different from this vision that I had started with that I found so bizarre. A much more congenial vision. And the way I express it in the book, at the end of the book, is basic economic reasoning. The sort of stuff that you get in Econ 101, 102 is the kind of stuff that is of use, of value. The undergraduate education in economics is supremely valuable because it helps you understand the world. If you go into the higher reaches, I think the payoffs are much more quickly fall off. Not everyone, obviously, who's an economist would agree with that, but it is something I take away from this. And a good way to test it is to say, you know, how good of the predictions, well, how good have economists been about predicting? What a time to ask the question in 2009, okay? I don't want to have a straw man here, but here we go. Okay, so just again, in the case that you, after all of this, still thought you might be interested in the book, let me give you a further warning and tell you the structure of the book. It may dissuade you or it may attract you. Again, 3 parts. Everything's in threes. I'm not an Hegelian, but in this lecture, everything's in threes. The first part is about the early history of the Austrian school. Why is that necessary? Well, because nobody has history of thought. Very few people get history of thought anymore. So if you're going to tell people about the Austrians, particularly if you're going to tell economists about it, you have to review it. So there's Karl Menger's in there, the Methodenstreit. This is the battle with the German historical school, which is important in formulating the methodological views of the Austrians. By the way, my hook is that understanding methodology is a good way to read both the development of the Austrian school or certain aspects of the development of the Austrian school, and also of Hayek's views. And also, there's a section there about the debates over socialism and logical positivism. Now, Hayek's an Austrian, and this philosophy of science that dominated and then died, but was so influential that he's so opposed, originated in Vienna, where he was a student. He had friends who attended the Vienna Circle, who would bring back reports. Part of the reason that Mises started writing as much on methodology was, in a sense, to oppose the positivism of the Vienna Circle. So these are debates that were alive at the time, before any of this stuff hit in the mainstream in economics.
And his own brother, right? Ricard? Mises? Wasn't he part of the Vienna Circle?
Okay, Mises' brother. Okay, right. I was going to say neither Hayek's brother. Yes, that's right. Exactly right.
Well, Hayek's second cousin started Vienna Circle.
This is good. This is good. Yeah. Well, it was a smaller world back then. Certainly Vienna was. Okay. The second part is Hayek's journey. where I talk about the various twists and turns. One of the things, again, just look at that. What I find one of the many things I find fascinating about Hayek is look at all the places he's making contributions to. He's got, the capital using monetary economy that Roger has been talking to you about. You got socialism that Steve Horowitz was talking about. Right? He gave the lecture. And the Abuse of Reason Project. Boy, I'd love to come back here sometime and do that, because this is one that I just finished editing. This collected works version of this will come out, and his arguments in the 1940s about scientism, etc. And then his political philosophy, constitutional liberty. He's got the sensory order, which I linked in the Abuse of Reason Project because part of the origins of it were debates with people like Neurath in these just prior to this. And then his later work on complex orders. And then, of course, it comes back to money back in the 70s, denationalization money. Roger had that quote where, of course, he's going to come back to money in the 70s. We've got stagflation then. He's finally saying, yeah, you see? Okay. And then you've got the fatal conceit. So so I tell a little bit about that story. And finally, the end part is again to make the methodological point that, what if Hayek was as right about the methods of economics as he was about socialism? What could we learn from that? And the conclusion that I alluded to earlier, that perhaps basic economic reasoning is the stuff that is most important in economics and the stuff that we should focus on. And I think that this is the sort of reasoning that you get in general in economics. I also would make a final plea. History of thought is a great field, and we need more people working in it. So if there's lots of people interested in history of thought here, let me encourage you if I can. Well, that's all I've got. So. Yes.
How do you think the attack by Piero Sraffa on affected Hayek? Because his response seemed almost like he was kind of blindsided, like he didn't know.
Okay. The question was, how did the attack by Piero Sraffa on Hayek affect him? And it seemed like he was almost blindsided. And I think that he took Sraffa's attack quite seriously. The person who's editing the collected works has two volumes coming out. One of them is going to have prices in production and monetary theory in the trade cycle. And then the other one will have a series of essays that took place during that time. And in his editor's introduction, he says that he thought that Hayek's response was weaker than it could have been, that he could have responded more strongly than he did, and he perhaps I think the reason why that would have happened is just as Keynes' response to the attacks on a treatise on money caused him to withdraw and then come back out with the general theory, Hayek decided, I think, and Larry White's here and he would be able to confirm the exact dates, but somewhere around 1930, late 32 or early 33, that you've got to get rid of the average period of production, you've got to make a lot of changes, and he struggled for 7 years trying to reformulate his framework. So it could be that he was saying, well, if I'm reformulating the framework anyway, I can do it in such a way where I can avoid some of these problems. That would be.
I myself, I studied philosophy of science. I heard the analytic-synthetic distinction. So may I ask your position on that?
What is my position on it?
Yeah, I myself take the Quinian Salurzian position after two dogmas of empiricism and Pearson's philosophy of mind.
Yeah, that was a destructive criticism of it, right?
Yeah.
I'm not a philosopher of science. Yeah, I'm not a philosopher of science, so I don't have a position on it, actually. I am aware, obviously, of Quine's powerful 1950 critique, or whenever it was. What was interesting to me was simply to see that there was this huge opposition. Where were these people coming from? And trying to tease it as an historian. I mean, that's what I viewed my role as, is more than taking specific sides. Although I have to say, the way I approached it when I was first writing about that stuff in 1984 was to say, look, given that positivism has been basically disavowed by philosophers of science, this means that many of the arguments that have been made against people like Mises have no foundation. So are there other arguments that could be made? And my position at that time as somebody interested in methodology was what is important is to continue, and this probably shows okay.
And,
Sorry.
do you think the denial of the analytic synthetic distinction, the kind of subsequent pragmatism that took over philosophy of science, leads us into the type of solipsism?
I'm not sure how to answer that. I have a feeling that you have views on it.
If your question is, and I'm going to ask another follow-up question, the answer is no.
Okay. Well, perhaps this is something we can talk about later, and you can tell me what your position is, and then I'd be able... I can't really tell because that was kind of a telegraphed point you made. Yes?
There is no debate on the compatibility between Hayek's methodological individualism in his papers in the 40s and then his later evolutionism, his theory about cultural evolution through group selection. So I think your position is that he wasn't really a methodological individualist in the beginning, as it is commonly understood. But nowadays you also have these cultural evolutionists who believe in group selection, such as Boyd and Richardson, for example, and who say that their theory is both compatible with some kind of methodological individualism as well as collectivism, methodological individualism, in the sense that they acknowledge that group selection suffers the free rider problem, right? There's a lot of methodological individualists who say group selection can never work with the free rider problem, and individuals have the incentives to free ride. But these new modelers, they say that, okay, you have two forces, and sometimes the free riding problem will outweigh the group selection problem.
Right.
Sometimes
So it's an empirical question, was which one's going to...
it's indeed an
be
empirical
dominant,
question,
right.
but like Hayek was very much aware when he talked about cultural evolution that there was this free rider problem, and he
Yes.
said we need punishment, and if there is no punishment, the group selection will not work. So I would maybe say he was still a methodological individualist, even in his evolutionary days.
Right. Well, this is you're getting at some interesting new literature. Let me say why I made that point in Hayek's challenge. It seemed to me that if you think of methodological individualism in the way that many of the critics, there's lots of people like Jeff Hodgson who say, well, and methodological individualism is bad, and da-da-da-da-da-da. We need a more holistic view. He's not a holist. He wants to have both institutions and individuals involved. I think the Austrians have always been that way, that having both of those in there. But if you look at Hayek's work as opposed to Karl Menger's work, or Mises's work, or mainstream neoclassical economics, where you start with the consumer, you start with the firm, you start with acting man, you start with an agent with preferences in Menger. You don't get that kind of construct as a beginning point, a grounding in Hayek's work. He's often talking much more about institutions, about groups and individuals within groups. So it's in contrast with those others that are approaching it in that specific way that I would claim that he's not a methodological individualist in that sense. certainly the compatibility, though, I take your point on this later work. And I think actually, I'm not denying that he doesn't think of individuals as important. It's just starting points of his theories, you don't see that. Yes. Yes, Frank.
I think that Steve, Dr. Horowitz made this point about that he felt like maybe Hayek just agreed with Mises, and so he went on beyond and dealt with things in kind of beyond what Mises was dealing with, kind of taking that as a basis without necessarily saying so much. And then would that be a reasonable?
On the socialist calculation debate?
Well, even on methodology. I mean,
Okay.
basically he's dealing with a different type of problem. He's not dealing with the, how can you tell, the person has preferences and the about roundaboutness and things like that so much individually. He's been talking about it more institutionally and how to put this institution together where you're going to have groups working together with individuals in there. He just didn't deal with the individual part at that point.
Okay, so it's a continuing questions on the methodological individualism part, saying perhaps he agreed with the foundations that Mises had already laid, and then just went from there. And I think there's nothing. I have no problem with that is a possibility. Actually, I need to make sure we distribute the questions. So yes.
Well, I just want to say that I'm a law student, so I really like, high approach on law. But I want to see your point of view of some critiques that I've heard from some academics about their volume of law legislation and liberty and where he proposes a system. And I want to, doesn't come from me, but I've heard that, what he proposes in that system, which, seems logical, but at the same time, it's a little bit of, constructivism in a way, and I want to see what your point of view regardless of that.
Right. So the question is about, towards the end of his life, Hayek is constantly writing about spontaneous orders, and he gets to volume 3 of Law, Legislation, and Liberty, and he has a model constitution, which seems to be a construction, constructivist rationalism at its most extreme. So there's various sorts of responses to it. The one that I think I feel most comfortable with is if you're looking at Hayek's evolutionary thought, what he says is different proposals come up all the time. All different sorts of proposals, and most of them get shot down. They don't work. So on one level, you can say anyone's free to propose something. Here's my utopian world. And he's actually pretty explicit before in the 2 or 3 pages that precede his description of his model constitution, was that he is of course not proposing that people actually adopt this. And he has all sorts of qualifying language that is meant to say, but these are these get at some of the issues that I think are problematical with unlimited democracy, which is what he was worried about in Law, Legislation, and Liberty. Constitutional liberty says we can limit democracy, and with a strong constitution, it's the best system. In Law, Legislation, and Liberties, he says, I'm worried because there's all sorts of changes that are taking place where legislation is replacing grown law and the rest. So one way to read this is, this was just his proposal, one among many, and then the evolutionary process will sift out and see whether his or some other combination or something else persists. Yes, follow up.
Yeah, just as a follow-up, I don't know if you're familiar with the project of our model, it's actually based on the constitutional model that Hayek has on this.
I didn't know that. Which, where, I'm sorry. Oh, in Guatemala. Yeah.
It's being promoted, even for the fact that we have just one Congress, like the proposal is about having a Senate and Congress too, and it's getting, I don't think it's going to be politically viable, but
Yes.
it's still a really good way of getting the ideas out there. So, I don't know, I just wanted to know.
Right. So the point being made, it says here, repeat the question, so I'll repeat the comment, is also that this is actually being looked at more seriously as potentially a model in Guatemala. Yes.
One little comment, one question. First of all, I read your book a while ago, and I loved it, so...
Talk to everyone.
And the second one is, I was wondering if you could comment on the difference between Hayek's and Mises' view on how orders emerge, and if there is a substantial difference. And if so, which is the purpose?
Well, the question is the difference between Mises and Hayek on how orders emerge. And I have to say, I don't know the answer to that. You know? Does anyone want to try? Steve?
I'm not sure exactly what the question is. I think in Mises there is a pretty, what I think, clear notion of the idea of spontaneous order, at least the orders that emerge from human action and not human design. And I think the most telling passage in the discussion of Menger's theory of money, he has a little section, human action, called the epistemological import from that Menger's theory of money, where he talks about how it's a model, that kind of story of emerging order is a model for how economics is done. I think there's other places in Mises too where you see him talking about what we now call unintended consequences of order the same way. If you go back to my talk this morning, I think it's fair to say that Mises emphasized the human action part of human action, but not human design, more than Hayek did. Hayek is more emphasizing the not a human design part of human action, but not human design. So I think but it's the same process, and they're just choosing, I think, to emphasize different sorts of things. We saw this morning there is an entrepreneur in Hayek's work, but it's not as prominent.
It's buried.
As it is in Mises, and Mises, they're emphasizing different elements of the same story. I don't know if that's gets to the question. That's how I would.
So Steve's answer was human action, the unintended consequences of human action, and Mises was the human action part, and Hayek was the unintended consequences part. As a matter of emphasis, would be the answer to that excellent question. Yeah, that's great, Steve. Thank you. In the back.
I have a question concerning the use of reason. How did Hayek differentiate between social sciences and natural sciences? I know that goes back to Aristotle, but I'm wondering where he, how he exactly defines those two sciences and also just how does it lead to the century organism order?
How does it link to the century? Okay. So the question is, what sort of distinction between the natural methods of the natural and social sciences was Hayek making in the scientism essay, and how does that link up with the sensory order? So, in the scientism essay, what Hayek criticizes is what he calls scientism, right? Which I defined as the use of the methods of the natural sciences where they don't belong, inappropriately. Well, Popper pointed out that what he was describing as the methods of the natural sciences were never followed anywhere. These are what people claimed were the methods of the natural sciences. So he later backpedaled on that. But what he criticized was what he called the objectivism, the collectivism, and the historicism of the scientific approaches. And under each one of those categories, objectivism, an example would be behavioral psychology, where you say that you can't talk about individual subjective states, you just have to measure what is in people's behavior. That's all that you can do in psychology. And he had examples for each one of these. He contrasted these with his preferred approach, which, if you think of the Austrians' approach to economics, are words that would describe it. Subjectivist, as opposed to objectivist. Theoretical, and individualist. Okay? So he does have that as the approaches that he would favor. And he describes objectivism is the chapter that is the longest. And he wrote a student essay which will be translated and produced in the sensory order volume of the collected works that Victor Vanberg is working on. In 1920, a student essay on psychology that he pulls out in 1945 and ultimately becomes his 1952 book, The Sensory Order. So he's offering an alternative approach to psychology from behaviorism in that. And it started out, this is part of the joy of working in archives, if you go to the archives and look at the first, his first attempt, he thought this was going to be an essay that he'd polish off in the summer. It takes him 7 years to get it published. But his first attempt is called What is Mind? And within 2 paragraphs of beginning, he starts criticizing behaviorism. So it's clear that his image of what this article was going to be was a critique of behaviorism. What it ultimately turns out to be is this marvelous essay, very dense and difficult, but important essay in philosophy of mind, theoretical psychology, cognitive psychology, whatever you want to call it. So that was the connection. It was in critiquing this objectivist approach that was in the Abuse of Reason project.
Sounds like you just said that he was a methodological individualist.
He defended an individualist approach in these things. When I argued that he wasn't an individualist, I said, look at his actual work. Look at monetary theory in the trade cycle and prices in production. You've got consumption by a group. You've got investment by a group. You don't start with individuals in the same way that Mises did. That was the precise way that I was arguing on that. But yes, of course, and he also wrote Individualism, True and False, 1945. That poses some arguments, some problems for my view, which I acknowledge. This is one reason why you should take the book out from the library. You'd be able to see this. Yes? There are 3 of you. I think this is a little unfair.
So I also wanted to ask a question on Hayek's legal theory.
Okay.
From my reading of the Constitution of Liberty, it seems to me that Hayek is subscribing to what is essentially a positivist theory of the law, in the tradition of Kelsey, or not very far from Kelsey. And his later works on evolutionary law, it changed his mind completely. Would you agree with this interpretation, or do you think that there is a way to reconcile the Constitution of Liberty and one of law legislation of liberty and other works?
Okay. I think this is perhaps a discussion for later, because I think what you need to do is articulate the statement was that the Constitution of Liberty was a kind of a legal positivist or a legal realist approach, similar to Kelson's approach, but that he changed his mind with law, legislation, and liberty. I'd need to have a lot more detail for your argument to engage you on it. It should be pointed out, though, that I think it was only in 1960, after the Constitution of Liberty, that he started talking more with Leone, which may have had more of an impact. But obviously, I mean, he's criticizing Kelsen, pages and pages of it, in Law, Legislation, and Liberty. And he's not kind to Kelsen when he refers to him in earlier pieces. If you look at the preface to the 1956 version of Road to Serfdom, I think Kelsen is mentioned there, but he's certainly mentioned somewhere in the Road to Serfdom where he says you can't believe even this important professor is making these category mistakes. So perhaps we'll talk later. Was there another question here? No? Okay. Yes? Oh, this will have to be the last one. I just looked at my watch and realized. Yeah. Oh, what? 5:30. Ask a long question. These are really great questions. The question was, think of the differences between, for example, Rothbard and Hayek and how they justify their political theory. And I think they are different. They do perhaps reach similar conclusions in some areas, perhaps not all areas, obviously. But I think, Hayek, if you look as far back as the Constitution of Liberty, and he repeats it in law, legislation, and liberty, he says, well, some people who have taken these positions have approached it from a natural law position or natural rights positions, and I'm not going to do that because and he usually has a kind of a throwaway line, it's too complicated, these words mean too many different things to different people, and kind of avoids dealing with it. But I think the key here is to look at Hayek's evolutionary theory. If you take his evolutionary theory seriously, he's saying that so much of what we are is just simply the stuff that survives in an evolutionary competitive environment. And if that's true, and you agree also with the stuff he has, his frequent invocation of Hume, how these things that our morals are not the result of reason, but they're the result of something else, some evolution through time. If that is a serious view, then to turn around and then try to ground your theory in some sort of other theory that's other than this evolutionary process, you get into a conundrum. So I think he took his evolutionary theory seriously. And he says there are certain moral beliefs that in combination with these other social institutions have allowed a vast increase in human wealth and liberty, and they can be gone too. There's nothing necessary about them, but we do know, and they've also created a huge increase in population, and if we get rid of the institutions, we can see a drastic drop in population. A lot of times by the end of his life, that was one of the criteria he was using, just to say, well, it's not so much that people love living under this system, it's that if you get rid of it, it's really going to be bad. So I think that would be how I'd go with that. Yeah. Yes?
So then do you agree with John Gray's claim that he's indirect utilitarian in the Rothbard question, why Rothbard would be a natural rights utilitarian?
Well, Hayek is certainly not a natural rights one, and the indirect utilitarianism is I think, once you start to get into terminology, it becomes difficult. But I mean, in some places, he certainly seems to be that way. Yeah. What do you think?
Yes, I think he is.
Yes.
He makes a distinction between.
He makes that distinction in law, legislation, and liberty between the two. Right.
Act and rule.
Act and rule.
He uses the terms act and rule.
He doesn't. He uses different terms, but it looks like act and rule. Right.
So, it seems to be a rule utilitarian, so he's afraid if everybody calculates too much,
Right.
that the results will be bad, that he believes that everybody, if they follow certain rules, that the consequences will be best, right? So that's indirect utilitarianism.
Okay. So I didn't understand. I thought of him as closer to a rule utilitarian. If that's what indirect means.
It's related to us.
Okay.
Indirect
Right.
utilitarianism actually means that the decision-making procedure individuals use should not be rationalistic, should not be calculative, but that the way you judge it should ultimately be, the criterion should be good consequences. But they
Right.
should not consciously pursue
Right.
good consequences. That's direct.
By individual. Yes. Okay. I think that's close to Hayek's view. But we may have other opinions here. Yeah? Okay. Yes, you've been very patient.
I was wondering what you thought about Lawson's and Fleetwood's thesis that Hayek is sort of proto-critical realist. I don't know.
Okay, so the question is, there's a wonderful man named Tony Lawson and one of his students, Steve Fleetwood. Tony's at Cambridge, and Tony is a student of, philosophically, of a view called critical realism. So if you read a Tony Lawson paper, I've known Tony for 30 years, 25 years. Okay, so he started sending me papers a long time ago, and before he had his book, I mean, every paper would have to lay out his framework, which got to be quite tedious. So sometimes I didn't read the papers as carefully as I should. But his view and Steve's view is that Hayek started out kind of not really being a critical realist, but slowly through time became one. So I'm not going to try to explain what critical realism is, but this is the view. Well, what you have to understand, and this is a dispute between two old friends, I find that approach to history of ideas to be not particularly productive. In other words, well, let's look at Alfred Marshall, let's look at Friedrich Hayek, let's look at this variety of figures and see how close they come to this standard, which I think is the appropriate standard. So Hayek was not such a good critical realist early, but in his later work he seems like he became one. I find that to be an awkward way to pursue history of ideas. I think an alternative way is to, and this is what I try to do in my work, is to say, where is that person at a particular point in time, try to fill in the context of what sorts of issues he was dealing with at that time, and why, and then he made those particular moves in response to those issues.
So you think it's a rational reconstruction?
A rational reconstruction, yes. And yeah, there are elements of what Lawson calls a critical realism in Hayek. There's no question about that. But the general approach that Lawson is taking, I'm not sure is one that, and I may be somewhat unfair in that caricature in this brief thing, but that would be the way I would, in a brief statement, where I disagree. Steve?
I wanted to ask you two questions, especially since you won't be here for the last half of the discussion on Friday. One of those is, what do you think the areas are now in Hayek studies and recent Austrian economics, I guess, where students should be pursuing, where there's really big questions that need to be pursued, and that would be good dissertation topics and good research topics. That's one question. The second question is, what kind of advice would you give students who want to go into the history of ideas, history of economics, thought, other than, it's a dangerous world out there. What advice would you give them as they think about that as possible?
Right. Well, remember my mission from God, that I've got this center. So I was at University of North Carolina, Greensboro for a long, long time. And at some point, I wrote a letter to a guy who runs a foundation in North Carolina and said, look, I'd like to start a center at Duke that would promote research in and the teaching of the history of economic thought, because as people retire, they're not being replaced. There's not many graduate programs that even teach history of economic thought anymore. And this is the only place, not the only place, but a prime place where students actually learn the ideas associated with people in the Austrian tradition. It's probably the only place they'd learn about Adam Smith and really read any Smith, but also Karl Marx, Alfred Marshall, any of it. Where are economists going to get this? Economists there's a group called the Post-Autistic Economics Group that comes out of France, and if there are people who are involved with the autism movement, some are offended by that name, but the idea is that economists increasingly are unable to talk to people outside their own discipline. They're unaware of the world around them. It's not a very flattering portrait, and certainly trying to reintroduce history of thought is something that I think could be a useful thing, particularly at the undergraduate level, but also at the graduate level. So what we're trying to do at the center is to revive the history of thought. This operates on many fronts, and I'll get to your first question as we get there. Duke is a great place for this because the major journal in the field, History of Political Economy, is published there. In addition to me, there's 4 other faculty members who are interested in the history of thought, who do the history of thought as research. There's an archives there with the papers of 8 Nobel Prize-winning economists. The Hayek papers in microfilm version are there. Vernon Smith's papers are there. Doug North's papers are there. and we're soon going to be getting some other prominent economists, Nobel Prize winning papers there. So there's archival work to be done. This summer, two of the people who came to the center, so the center brings in people who are more senior, who come to work on a research project for a year, and then we bring in four people who are just out of PhD school. If you didn't go to Duke and you were interested in history of thought, you could come to the center for a year. Some of the people who came, they spent the summer working in the archives, researching this stuff. Friedman needs a biographer. Buchanan needs a biographer. When we talk about topics, these are not necessarily Austrian topics, but there are major figures in the history of economics who don't have anyone to write their biographies. And at that point, the default position is something like a Naomi Klein sort of treatment, or who's the person who did the A Beautiful Mind? I mean, it's much better than Naomi Klein, but this is not someone who is trained as an economist, so it would be difficult for that person to actually access the theoretical ideas of the person. It can tell a good story, make it into a movie. Russell Crowe, everybody's happy, but I mean, this is not history of thought. Okay, it's not history of thought. So given my mission, the way I would have answered this on the last day was to stress that there are possibilities. Now, what would happen if somebody came to Duke and they entered the program? They go through a rigorous PhD program, a very tough one, and then could, in their last couple of years, specialize in this. You'd have the access, resources of the faculty as well as the center. Let's say you didn't want to go to Duke. Hey, I went to Chapel Hill. I would never recommend anybody go to Duke, okay? But you could go to Chapel Hill and take courses at Duke. You could go to NC State and take courses at Duke. You can take, we're having a summer program for people who have gotten their PhDs and who are on faculty to come in, and it's a boot camp. Remember the camp that I talked about where Roger was my teacher? Well, it's modeled on that, only it's 3 weeks long, where we teach people history of thought so that they can take it back and start studying it. One thing I would ask you, if you're an undergraduate, is go into your department head and demand, as a student with rights, that a history of thought be offered, because you want it. It's important. You'd like to learn some of this stuff that you're not getting in your other economics class. You'd probably throw you out of the office. But, at least you're sending a signal. If people start doing this over and over again, they might say, hey, maybe this is a course that people like. I find, actually, undergraduates typically find this stuff fascinating, because it gives you some sense of where your discipline has come from. If you like economics, it's a great course. If you hate economics, it's a great course.
So high.
It's a tautology. No matter what you feel, it's a great course. I'm getting away with too much here. Okay.
Whatever you said.
Okay.
What are the big questions?
Okay.
What's the big question that I on economics?
Okay. I think there are still things in the archives that have not been sufficiently mined. One of the areas that I think is quite interesting has to do with the role of Hayek in the formation of the Chicago School. There have been some recent arguments by Phil Murawski that Hayek was essential in the formation of the Chicago School of Economics, that he was the one who helped bring together the principles. I think there's some flaws to the argument, but that would be one thing. The history of the Mont Pelerin Society in a way that there's Hartwell's, but that's so much more could be done. So much more could be done there. There's work with the sensory order that I think, particularly if people have German as a first language, there's huge numbers of things in the archives that have so far been unexploited. Jörg Klausinger, who is doing the volumes on business cycle theory, discovered in the archives Hayek's plans for a book-length manuscript back in the late 20s that incorporated the 1928 intertemporal equilibrium article as one of the chapters, and has some parts of the essays that he's actually going to translate and include in the collected works, one of the volumes in the collected works. So there's stuff to be found there. Yeah, there's 130 boxes in the Hayek archives. So what does that mean? Well, a box is about this size, and the Hayek Popper correspondence takes up 2 folders in a box. So these things, there's a huge amount of stuff in there. I've spent maybe 4 weeks directly in the archives just working, feverishly while I was out there, because the archives are out in Hoover. I'm sure, I've probably gone through, well, a lot of stuff you can go through very quickly, because Hayek was one of these guys who, if somebody sent him a paper, he would keep the paper and the little standard 1 or 2 sentence thing that said, "Thank you so much for your paper. If I have a chance to get to it, and I have any comments to make, I will send them." So, you can actually flip through and say, no, not important, not important. But there's a lot of, I'm sure there's stuff that I've missed that's in there. Yeah. So all my stuff is in terms of history, history of thought stuff, right?
What was your other question? Your second?
He got them both. Advice for perspective, like thought, which not
Well, no, not necessarily. I mean, there was a guy from George Mason who finished his degree at George Mason who spent the year finishing his degree at Duke because he wanted to sit in on classes and be around people that he could bounce ideas off of. And I imagine he's going to get some papers. So we have it set up so that because we know not everyone's going to want to go to Duke, to be able to make it a place that people can come. The other thing is, the best thing to do is train as an economist and do stealth history of thought. Okay? And you can just, you can come to summer programs that we offer. You can do all sorts of things and actually get it as a field. And what we're hoping to do, actually, in a couple of years, is to have a summer program for people who have not finished their PhDs. You come, you take the boot camp, and then you're able to say when you go on the job market, well, look, yeah, I'm a labor economist. I've got these skills. And I also had this, we could give you a certificate if you want. Hell, it's not that hard to print them up. A certificate from Duke that, says that I can also teach undergraduate history of thought. Yeah, my goal is to just start getting it reintroduced in the curriculum because it's a great field. So there's lots of ways. If you don't want to do research in it, you can come and pick it up as a field. And I think it would probably advantage you rather than disadvantage you in the job market to have that as a supplement. Because actually, one last thing. In surveys of department heads, particularly at liberal arts institutions, they say, we want to have this course offered. We have the sorts of students who are going to benefit from it. It's just that the resource cost of the opportunity cost of giving up a faculty line to someone who can only teach that is not something we're willing to do. So this is a way of trying to enable people to have it as a field without having to say this is all I'm doing. Yes?
Is this a particular challenge for the economic field? Do you think, broad spectrum science, the history of thought would be more beneficial?
Well, yeah, my impression is that in political science, there's a political theory, which is actually political philosophy, as far as I can tell, is not in as bad shape as is history of thought and economics. So I think it is, in government or political science departments, it's still up. And also in political philosophy departments, there are people who are interested in the economics part. So I think that it persists in other areas. I can't speak knowledgeably in more detail than that. My impression too is that things are much better in Europe, and this is probably due to the fact that things are slower to change in the academy in Europe. It's harder to get change. So one of the this sclerosis that affects state bureaucracies has actually worked in favor of history of thought in European universities. Apparently, this is from accounts from friends. Yes.
Yeah, it's a little bit of something, but you might comment on how much I influence Harvard and vice versa. That corresponds?
Okay, the question is to what extent did Popper and Hayek influence each other? And I would urge you to read my paper, Hayek and Popper, Who Influenced Whom? But in a nutshell, my view is that they didn't have that much real influence on each other's ideas, but the language in which they were expressed, as they came to know each other better, they started to use each other's terms to express their ideas. So I don't see one or the other causing a change in direction due to the influence of the other, but a change in terminology certainly there. The one thing that Hayek says that Popper did was, for example, to say, well, it's not the methods of the natural sciences, it's what these objectivists and historicists and collectivists claim are the methods of the natural sciences. But Popper has described the real method of the natural sciences, which is conjectures and refutations, and this is the approach that I would embrace, for example. That would be a way where terminology becomes more important. I actually think a case could be made that that Popper's move from strict falsifiability as a criterion of demarcation to critical rationalism, which is a much broader definition of how to criticize theories, may have been under the influence of Hayek's gentle reminding him, saying it over and over again, even in papers that are dedicated to Popper, that when you're dealing with complex phenomena, progress often means moving to theories that are less strictly falsifiable, but there's other ways to criticize them. So I think it could be that Popper moved somewhat in that direction because of Hayek, but both of them, of course, always praise the other as being very important to their thought, but then they usually have a footnote where they say, well, I was actually thinking this before I met Popper. I was thinking this before I met Hayek. So. Yes. Yes. Yes.
I was wondering, while he was on the social thought, was he on there at the same time as Hannah Arendt?
Right. And this is one of the frustrating things with Hayek, even with 130 boxes in the archives. The question was, and you could ask this question not only about Hannah Arendt and Hayek being on the Committee on Social Thought in Chicago, but Hayek and Lionel Robbins, who were close friends. They used to walk into each other's house and take books off the shelves, and they almost like they were living in the same house. Other people who were important, Strauss at Chicago. What was their relationship? And the thing with Hayek was he moved frequently. Unlike Keynes, you can actually trace a lot of these things because Keynes had Cambridge, London, and his summer home in Tilton. Three places that he ever went. Hayek, each time he moved, he would have to throw things away. So he actually answered a letter at one point asking about some relationship and saying, I had stuff, but I was just relentless. I had to be relentless in tossing stuff out. When you move from London to Chicago, when you move from Chicago to Freiburg, you went from Freiburg to Strasbourg, and then back to Freiburg. So stuff was lost. So absent any kind of correspondence, it's very hard to answer that question. Who knows? He does do interviews late in life, but these are always suspect because there's one of my favorite papers by me is one where I went through and looked at his response to his relationship with Keynes spread over about 25 years, and he would use the same language, the exact same phrasing. And after 25 years, you're asked a story, and you don't remember what happened. You remember the story the last time you tell it. Well, we all do this. There's probably a tape of my Hayek lecture that I just gave in Phi somewhere, where there'll be passages that'll be the same because if you figure out a way to express an idea, you want to use it over again. So it's not unique to Hayek, but that then makes interviews a little, unless you have other confirming information, a less reliable source for information. Yes. Okay, one final question. Yes.
Doesn't very often quote Mises, but these ideas are often very similar. Would you have an idea why?
Why didn't Hayek quote Mises more? And so I'll end with an observation made by Bill Bartley. Bill Bartley was the first general editor of the Hayek collected works. He was also supposed to be Hayek's biographer and Karl Popper's biographer. Bartley was a student, research assistant under Karl Popper. And he said, Hayek and Popper. Popper wasn't very kind to his successors, his students, and Hayek was insufficiently kind to his predecessors, saying that Hayek often failed to acknowledge ideas that may have been due to others. I would think if you take a look at Counter-Revolution of Science, for example, Max Weber is, in some passages, all over the place. Never mentioned. Strange. It's just strange. Perhaps he thought it was common knowledge, but perhaps partly was right, too. So, thank you very much.